is the Integral Stages Meta Podcast series, where we podcast podcasters, broadcast broadcasters, and generally explore online projects where people are trying to bring forth higher, deeper, more developmental, and more transformative perspectives. Joining us today is Eric Reynolds to talk about the Clubhouse app, the Integral Leadership Academy, and more. Hey.
Hey.
I'm hearing a lot of people excited about Clubhouse. But also we all just have a limited budget of time and interest for new apps and platforms, right? We're sort of suffused in podcasting, YouTube, Facebook, Twitter. There's the Integral Life site. There's the new Game B platform. I talked to a guy doing spiral dynamics on TikTok, proliferating Discord and Telegram groups, and the meta modernists and the intellectual deep web are still using email lists. So it's too much, especially when we're working with complex, nuanced content. So my question is, why Clubhouse? Why is Clubhouse worth it?
I mean, for me, the easiest answer is because you have to listen, and everybody else has to listen. And it's. I know when I'm engaging online and across various social media platforms, I'm fragmented. Part of me is typing out something, part of me is doing something else, and it's still a little bit on Clubhouse. But because of the nature of the app, I mean, you sit there and especially the way our rooms run, they're basically 2-hour long form podcasts with a live audience that has a chance to participate in the cast. So the field of sort of generative coherence that gets built up, and also the way we're using it is an evolutionary learning community. So a lot of the folks that are in our room are in there every week or 2-3 times a week. And it's personally, I don't know why I should be doing this versus anything else, except I was called at the beginning of February to step in. And it is certainly in my own personal practice and with my collaborators with ILR and beyond, and the sort of nascent Integral Leadership Academy that Brett has lit a fire under us to make happen sooner rather than later. So, yeah, for me, the real magic is in the personal connectivity of it, like hearing someone's voice without necessarily having to be sitting here in front of the camera. Like, I'm wearing my work clothes today because I'm in the middle of a remodel and doing drywall. So if I was on Clubhouse, I'd probably be down there doing a little bit of drywall, sort of physically engaged, but with my entire, presence listening in. And it's just a different sort of reality. Global, sort of way I think of it too, is it's a global conference. It's sort of science and non-duality meets Davos meets Burning Man, meets a bunch of other stuff. So, word of caution, it's addictive. It can be a time suck. I mean, if someone doesn't have boundaries around this, then yeah, the more is only going to suck you in and chew you up and spit you out.
So it's definitely engaging for people. It sounds, you make it sound very ambient.
I mean, it's like life. It is what you make of it, right? And who you surround yourself with. So the way the app is designed is you follow people, and then when they're speaking or they're in a room, you get a notification, and you follow clubs. And so you're curating your content by who you're associating with. And then the more you spend time in these rooms, you're creating actual personal connections with people. So I'm actually going for a walk tomorrow with someone I met on Clubhouse who lives in the same town that I live in Aurora, Ontario. Never would have kind of come across him. Like 5 different collaborators from Toronto so far in the last 2 months with different things that are starting to pop up that I've also met on Clubhouse. So that part of synchronistic, connection is also interesting. The difference between this and other apps too, I've noticed, is because, and it's sort of the other side of the elitist invite only beta version of this is it is highly curated. It started out with, Silicon Valley people and sort of, a lot of blockchain sort of folks, I think too. That's anything Silicon Valley. And then as it built, people would be going through their phone list and be like, who am I going to invite? But it's a little different than sending an invite to somebody on Facebook, right? There's already 5 billion or whatever people on there. Whereas in this, you're sort of present with the fact that, you are vouching for someone because it says you brought this person on, however they are on the platform, like it's going to come back to you. And then in the last 2 months now, I guess, so February, there were like 2 million users. Now it's over 10 million. And so that flowering of the amount of people, and then in terms of the connectivity, like it doesn't matter who you're in a room with, whether there's some big time influencer out in the world or not, you send them a direct message, hey, was in a room with you on Clubhouse, and you get a response back. And it's just a different level of openness between participants. And openness, and again, like there are rooms in there for just to get rich quick. There are rooms in there. How do I get 1 million, followers on Clubhouse in 2 days or whatever? I don't know. But there is a lot on consciousness and psychedelics and alternative forms of government, and and a lot of people in higher positions in governments and organizations around the world who are sort of using their free time, or they'll be at work, they have a half an hour, 20 minutes. They know of various rooms or people they follow, they can pop in and listen. I know a lot of people in our rooms, like they'll come in, they'll have to go back to work, they'll come back in, write me after, man, that was so great. Like we had Carol Sanford on this past Sunday, and a lot of people never heard of her, and now they have. It was good.
You mentioned Aurora, and I'm running into a lot of interesting things happening in Ontario these days. I moved out to Thunder Bay a couple years ago, and I talked to, I don't know if you know Alexander Bard from Sweden, but he was telling me yesterday that his first trip once the COVID is released is going to be to Toronto.
Nice.
For Vakey and the STOA and, the Perimeter Institute. There's a lot of fascinating intellectual stuff happening in Ontario. And because I was thinking of that, I thought of Marshall McLuhan. And this take on media is that the way the digital space is going to move is sort of inherently towards village-like and ambient spaces. And that sort of sounds like what you're describing. It seems like it's the appropriate next step in terms of what digital sculpts us to be ready for.
Absolutely. And our Integral Leadership Club is that. It's a club. We're, for integral leadership, which how we understand that, it's about personal and group development, and how to, take our own gifts and give them to raise other people up and to regenerate the planet and to, step into a greater expression of humanity. I thought it was funny though, when you first mentioned Aurora. I was like, wow, what else is going on in Aurora? Are you crazy? We're moving out of here. It's a nice town. But Ontario and Toronto in general, definitely coming up on my radar as a bit of a portal, if you will, of good consciousness and good tech and good immigration policies. All these things do come together. I met I forget his name at the moment, Dr. Yusuf, I believe, has a management institute in Ontario. And so we want to see, where the synergy is there. And we are actually looking, we being my wife and I, one of our bigger projects is to start a regenerative community development in Ontario. It's like somewhere within the GTA, and have that sort of everything that's coming out on the technology side, and also what we understand in terms of community and developmental, realities, and then add to that a transformative event center in Nordic Spa, and have that be, just sort of a place where we can, where we can live, and then other people can gather, so that we have a bit of a home base.
Yeah, that's the Game B guys have been sort of forecasting that 2021 is when they would start trying to set up communities. And so I see a lot of that move starting to happen, and there definitely needs to be something like that going on in Canada. And there's a ton of people in these discourse spaces that are from Canada. So I think if they could start talking to each other about how to set these things up, there'd be a tremendous amount of interest.
Mm-hmm.
I'd be tempted.
It's definitely a thing, and just out of the necessity of it. So conventional developers are developing quote unquote regenerative. And they're more sort of zero carbon developments, but it's even that it's already obvious to be done. So when that's the base level, and then what can we do when we understand community and start to think about like the community agreement you have in a development, like the condo association or whatever that the correlate is. When you start to have ways of interacting built into that actually my brain is dying. I thought we were just talking today. I didn't know you were going to put me on stage. I wasn't paying attention.
We don't have to release it if it goes too far astray.
That's fine. I'm not attached to my own image. But it is for me the Clubhouse is a sort of a fractal manifestation of that larger idea of having an actual fixed community. I have some pretty severe social anxiety most of my life up until the last few months. I've had a pretty monastic life in terms of how many people I actually interact with, personally and verbally. And my wife, Natasha, even saw that. It wasn't until Clubhouse really where I really started to settle in and step into my role as a leader in this field in a more grounded way, and in a way where I'm not having anxiety before I go on these calls. Last year, having this call set up with you, even not knowing I was going on stage, it would have been a half a day of feeling very anxious, and I'm still functional, but so I take that as a sign of both my own sort of personal ongoing development, healing, but also of the sort of I don't know the founders of Clubhouse, so I'm not sure like exactly where they were going on that, but the overall feeling of the space is a cleaner, more healthy manifestation of how we can come together socially. Certainly it can be misused, but the general guidelines are for equity and to pay attention to all the various biases and to really step into a more developmental sort of mindset, even if it is the crypto folks or the marketing folks. So I'm not sure how much that is the curation. Part of it is certainly my own, bias of who I'm hanging out with, obviously. But it is sort of also in the rules and the functioning of the app that you can't, like, if you're in a conference and you've got someone who's just going off the rails or taking over, the room, unless you have a really good facilitator who can field that or shut it down or do it else, it's not much you can do. On Clubhouse, you just move them to the audience. Give them some boundaries. Hey, yep, nope, this isn't the right space. Sorry, bye. And that's it. We had that yesterday. Robin did that because some dude just really felt like his piece was important. And it's like, sure it is. And that's not what this room is for. So, yeah, we're using it also as sort of a workspace to, how to be better facilitators in the world and the real world stuff that we're planning as well.
Seems like a pretty good endorsement of it if you're feeling comfortable with it and you've had anxiety about these kinds of interactions. I mean, obviously, like you're saying, some of that's your own growth, but the architecture, the space, and the kind of people you're dealing with, they're meeting you halfway.
Yeah, exactly. Like if this was like a supercharged, egoic corporate environment or something where, a lot of experts and you got to prove yourself, it wouldn't be worth my time. But the number of people coming with a more beginner's mind mentality, even, a lot of grounded, educated, developed people, and still they know, like like I know shit, right? Like, and if we really want to get to this sort of visions of some of what we envision possible, then we really got to all together know that we don't know shit, but together we might be able to do something. And this happens, at least in our rooms, those are the sort of people we attract from all sectors, which gets interesting too. So when are you guys going to come on?
Well, we're tempted. I mean, Bruce probably has a backlog of 15 interviews he still has to edit and post and things like that. So, our time's pretty taken up, but we're selectively interested in what other platforms to try out. And you're making this one sound pretty good.
well, in terms of the integral stage part, you could do both. You could have it on YouTube, have it on Clubhouse. You just have a warning that you're recording, and don't take questions and just do your thing. And then maybe at the end, if you garnered an audience, you could then open it for questions and have sort of a Q&A that also adds on.
Okay.
To use that time. And like, you guys are prolific and have a lot going on. And so adding something else is like.
Well, I think we'll almost certainly start experimenting with it and see where it goes. What is, the Integral Leadership Academy? What's the genesis of that project, and what are you hoping for? What could it become?
Yeah, that's a good question, because it's only just, in some ways, just forming. In other ways, like Brett said, I think it was 2004, 2006 when Russ redid the website. Brett Thomas was actually instrumental in helping him do that. And I don't know how long he's had the URL for Integral Leadership Academy, but that's been a sort of a intention for him for many years. And then for this year, another one of the things that we want to do is incorporate the Integral Leadership Research Institute. And it always been on my radar to have sort of a coaching consulting arm. And also, as I start to operationalize my own doctoral work research. And in that is just the reality that there's a need and a desire for just a more compact offering, which is what Brett has been doing for the last 20 years anyway, through Stagen and then beyond. And so the idea was, hey, why don't we just do this? And so what we want to do is do 6, 12, and 18-month cohorts, where a lot of it is the beauty of Brett's work is taking all this meta amazing mapping of the universe and social realities and bringing it back down into some very clear language that you can use with people who don't have any sort of exposure to integral or meta anything. And then just start work groups of people and see where it goes. And then, start online and see if there might be a in-person piece or regional pieces as well. See what wants to come together. I know one of the really important things to me for the Research Institute, one of the first projects I want to do is call it Mapping the Connectome, but actually getting a really integrate, basically probably another social media platform, but that actually maps people and resources and organizations that are doing this work. Like you said, like I can't keep track of the people I've met just on Clubhouse, just in Ontario at this point. So I need a resource to do that. And I could put it in Excel, there's some basic stuff out there, but at the same time, why don't we have a next level something that's a wiki for making good things happen,
I think that would be great. That would be really useful, because one of the things, I'm in so many overlapping communities, right? That always this question is, what is it that Integral and meta-modernism and Game B and XYZ have in common, right? And it's a good internal work to try to clarify that for ourselves, but to be able to see that, to see the map of who's connected to who and what we're really looking at, rather than just thinking in terms of name recognition chunks, that would be tremendously useful, I think.
Well, especially when those social networking algorithms are looking at how to connect resources and people and organizations and, and developmentally appropriate, right? Instead of, sending you an ad for the next thing to buy, right? It could be good.
We're already being mapped and profiled in terms of our networks.
Exactly.
So be able to get our hands on those controls and use them for something that's developmentally valuable.
Why not? I mean, I keep waiting for it. I know it's happening to a certain degree in gaming, and it's happened to a certain degree in media programming. I mean, there's some really conscious stuff. I definitely like watching, cartoons and my kids' programming better than a lot of stuff they put out for adults. But this stuff is filtering into all the very aspects of life, and may it, take root soon.
It has to. It just has to. Otherwise, if it doesn't colonize the systems that are colonizing us, then we're going to be pretty screwed.
Yeah, exactly. And so my next step is, how do I hold that knowledge lightly and, keep the joy in my heart? Yeah.
You've been working on leadership and transformation for a few years now. I think I saw somewhere that you got an MA from the California Integral Institute on leadership and transformation, something like that. What do you think is the most important thing you've understood about leadership since then, since you were sort of introduced to it in the last few years? What's starting to stand out as, that's more important, less important, different than I thought? What's emerging?
I mean, at the crux of it, I'd say that people are people. Before my academic training, I started life in upstate New York, pretty rural, pretty poor. And then we moved to California in my junior year of high school. And then I ended up going to UC Berkeley, which opened my eyes a little bit to the whole world isn't just upstate New York and in the woods. But having grown up poor and with, I'm the first, besides my aunt who became a soccer coach, I'm the first person to get even an undergraduate degree in my family. So not a lot of education, anything. And I grew up really hyperactive, reading a lot. So I was pretty educated from a very young age and had to sort of come to the understanding that people around me were ridiculously ignorant in some ways. And I had to learn just to modify my language because of what I'd learned reading, and then I'd be getting beat up in school because people were like, why are you talking down to me? I didn't know, right? And my uncles were some of the worst in terms of just ridiculously uneducated and said some of the most stupid stuff. And then on the other side of it, a great deal of the woodcraft that I learned from one of my favorite uncles. One that was a body mechanic. I'm pretty gifted with my hands as a carpenter and as a painter, and a lot of that came from them. And so there's this understanding that there's deep wisdom in people, and all the other stuff that also isn't. And then going to Cal, and then running a painting business, and then realizing, the painting business was so I wouldn't have to work to go to grad school. It's going to, make my million with a franchise. That didn't work. But I woke up and got to school, and then it was a whole nother process of looking up to these mentors and to these amazing people who wow, I can't imagine being you, but at the same time, I want to be here. And then learning from them, and then also being disillusioned. Holy shit, are you kidding me? And then the other side of the disillusionment of we're all just people, and we're all doing our thing as best we can. And so that's not academic, but at the same time, Russ was, I'm deeply blessed to have him as a mentor and a friend. The last 5 years of his life, we were very close. Natasha speaks to Jeannie every week. I'm usually there, sort of talking to her, but Tosh holds the space for that. And I don't know if a lot of people know this, but Russ's father was the founder of the Special Forces. He's the guy, General Russell William Folkman the first is the guy who brought MacArthur back to the Philippines after raising like a 20,000 person guerrilla army from warring tribes, right? He's in the bush getting warring tribes to work together, gets a hold of MacArthur on the radio, and he comes and, you know, does that thing. And so Russ was the first person of his lineage, or not first. Russ also went to West Point, but was honorably discharged, and then ended up getting a master's in Gestalt therapy and a PhD at UC Berkeley in political science. And I bring this up in terms of the leadership bit because, I mean, obviously that was a deep part of Russ's DNA. And at the same time, there was a sort of a transcending and including of going from that martial history, you know, into the transformative sort of reality of it, and how to take the sort of this learnings from his father, who he was then estranged from and then reconnected to, right? Yeah. And so I'm cognizant that that's part of this mantle that we hold as well. And Russ had to push back to a certain degree to formal power and to, you know, wealth, actually, which sort of is also part of the shadow of ILR and that we're cleaning up. And people are just people, especially now being on sort of, I grew up, I said already a couple times, pretty poor. My wife did not. And now we're in a whole different reality. And her dad would always tell her too, everybody puts their pants on the same way. And she grew up sort of at his side with that messaging. It's like, you know, don't project onto people because they have more money. Don't expect them to be better or worse, smarter or not. It's just another factor of reality. So I guess that's my 2 cents on leadership. Everybody's a person, and well, let's do our best to, you know, love one another.
Yeah, that's great. You know, it's like a deepening emotional and moral appreciation of universality, because it's very easy to think universally and not to really appreciate it. And you don't even know you were missing that appreciation until you get it.
Yeah. Well, yeah, and it's especially, I think if a person has grown up in more of an echo chamber of a certain sort of the mean green, for example, like that whole idea for me, like, first of all, I don't like it, but what it does look like for me is people who have been socialized with postmodern ideals, but they're still at an earlier stage of development. So you get your eco-Nazis, and you're like, you know, go down the list, right? Militant people about pluralistic realities. I don't know where I was going with that.
I don't know.
That's a whole paper I want to read. But.
Yeah, I mean, the contemporary situation is sort of plagued by these, I think, twin forms of pathological traditionalism. You know, one is a pathological traditionalism that got a bunch of postmodern ideas installed, and the other one is like an overtly ethnocentric regressive version of the same phenomenon. And I think they're both sort of angry at modernity, and almost correctly, because the way the modern system is set up is sort of sabotaged the life world and the conditions needed for healthy traditional growth. Yeah. One of the things I hear in what you're saying, it's a little bit similar to my own. I grew up on, you know, I didn't necessarily feel poor, but it was a very rural, very small, very backwoods community. Right. And so I grew up through a lot of those things that would be ancient ways of living. And it gives me a lot of sympathy for conservatives, or however we want to do the designations, that I think a lot of other people who grew up under more contemporary circumstances don't really have, because they haven't lived those conditions. And so they don't have those sensitivities and the ability to make a nuanced distinction between what they were really good at and how good a lot of those people are versus their weird, regressive and overly crude responses.
Yeah, it becomes more difficult when like Trump, for example, if I were to just write off anybody who voted for Trump, a good chunk of my family in both of the towns I grew up with, I would have to say, oh, I guess I'm having nothing else to do with you for the rest of my life. You know, where's that going to get us? Not very far. Yeah.
Exactly. And there's a kind of, first of all, yeah, it would write off a lot of people, a lot of people you're connected to, and a huge chunk of the population of the nation. But also there's things to appreciate there. They might be in the wrong spot. That's one of the things I felt about George Bush Jr. was, I feel like I know this guy. I feel like he lived in a cabin down the road from me when I was a kid. I wouldn't put him in charge of anything necessarily, but I get where he's coming from. There's things to appreciate. I like that glint in his eye.
And he spent some time in the country, right? On the ranch in Texas. It's the thing, I'm deeply grateful to have grown up a good chunk of my childhood barefoot in the woods, watching things grow year after year, day after day. Our nearest neighbor was a mile away. Lived on a dirt road for, I think, age like 8 to 15. So it was a really good formative period where I was just basically either camping in the Boy Scouts, which is a whole nother sort of leadership modality, or just in the woods at home, and listening. And life speaks if you slow down enough to listen to it.
Yeah, we were about 3 miles from the nearest paved road.
Mm-hmm.
Pretty remote, but a lot of wonderful opportunity and space just to be by yourself, to be in the woods, to be in a garden, or to be on the beach or whatever. Like you're saying, you learn a lot about the patterns of the world that we're nested in by just having nothing else to do except hang out in them.
And part of that is understanding the interconnectedness of community, of people, because it doesn't matter if you like somebody or not. You're rural like that, and the power goes out, and there's a snowstorm. You're checking on each other, because you need each other, and it's that simple.
My dad built a barn when I was really young, and I could hardly imagine putting the whole barn together. And then there's this photo of like 30 people, just helping put it together. I'm like, those people don't all agree about abortion,
The only thing, all those people, they're probably not even agreeing whether or not the barn should be built. They're just there to build it. Totally.
What, you gave us sort of a light biography there, and I was curious about transformational moments, peak experiences, glimpses of other kinds of consciousness. How did those things show up in your lifespan so far?
Yeah, I've had a few of those. I'm still sorting out my own story for myself. But yeah, since an early age, like there was a time when I was 5, it was the first, right around 5, peak experience I can remember, which was sort of more like what you would almost call a bad trip on LSD, because I was sick, highly feverish, and I remember trying to crawl out of bed and wanting to go to my parents' room, and I couldn't make it. And I ended up just sort of passing out in the hallway on the floor, and just felt this deep, dark thing just descending on me. And it was real, and it was suffocating me. And like I had a choice to panic or submit. And it was that was clear to me somehow in that moment. And so I submitted, and I only reinterpret this later as sort of the first memorable peak experience that I have. But looking back, it was because it was a sort of deep embodied signifier of how to be like present with the darkness, with the sort of anything that wants to take you out of your own core self, your own integrity. And then growing up in the woods, which one came first? So then the first sort of more typical peak experience that I can remember was the Boy Scouts at camp, and we were assigned to go in the woods by ourselves and just listen for an hour and take notes. And that forest came alive, the trees are breathing, the whole thing. I was like, wow, okay then. And then from there, I had a little bit, I want to say mystical, but certainly my connection with nature and with spirit has been more in that direction. And then at 13, I read this book, The Grandmaster. Brilliant. Recommend it to anybody. It's science fiction, and it's essentially Tibetan Buddhism in the sort of science fiction story where the good Lama is reincarnated into this Western boy, but he's already like 8, and he's a grandmaster in chess. And so the getting him out of his constructed reality and into like this thing, it was quite a process for these guys. And it started like with the first day, he's like, I'm hungry. And so the monk goes and gives him a goat, and he comes back and he eats it. And then he looks over to the guy leaves. He's like, looks over to the other monk. He's like, where did he go? It's like, well, he just killed an animal. There's only one thing he can do now. And that's like, balance that karma. And the kid's like, oh shit, because he's also the Lama, and they're going to do whatever they tell him. And he sat, and he went through the whole thing, he could swim underwater, be buried alive. But he's coming up on 18, and he's still not getting it, essentially. Like, it's not about that, dude. And so they sat him in front of the tree of life in the cave and had him crumple up and flatten out rice paper. Crumble up, flatten out rice paper. Day on day, week on week, month after month, started to be year after year, until finally one day, like, he's just completely out of his egoic mind and suddenly in communion with this tree, and it's breathing and the sap is flowing, and like suddenly he sees it, he's there, and that happened to me in that, and that's really my peak eye opener. That was after that I committed myself to at that time, besides the Buddhism, I was reading a lot of the Bible, and I committed myself to a life of Christ-like consciousness. Plenty from there. Grew mushrooms in college, did the psychedelic thing for a lot. And then other side of it, spiritual practice, meditating, also being a painting contractor and a martial artist, those all kind of came together. So I've had beautiful flow states doing that as well. And the PhD too. So that then brought it as the mind practice back full circle. So a couple.
What's your feeling about how you're related to Christianity now?
Good question. I've been meaning to bust out that New American Standard Bible that I was reading back in the day, because I know I had a lot of underlines. I'm curious what was calling me to them, because it is not like, certainly the fundamentalist bit of it is off-putting, and there's still some issues there with family members. I was spoken to by the New Testament, read it multiple times, the words of Jesus. So certainly, I consider Jesus to be one of my gurus, essentially. And that's how I hold it. So definitely is an important part of my life. Also being a Westerner, like it's in our culture. It's embedded in us in so many different ways. So in that way, I guess I would identify as a Christian, but in terms of, any cosmologies or anything, I'm beyond that, I guess, or not. I mean, I don't know. I was listening to Sam Harris yesterday. I was like, man, I really like this guy, except when he's just gotta be so mean. Dude, he got a chip. And I get it. It's like, but still.
Yeah, I wonder about that, the relationship between the traditional societies and the emergence of modern thinkers. And it's like replicated today as well in people's growth cycles. Are you like, what is it? What is it about the way the traditional society was handling the people who wanted to push forward strongly with their reason and individuality, which left those people with such a grudge? Like, did it have to go down that way?
I mean, a lot of them were burned at the stake.
Yeah. I mean, it's understandable. I just wonder whether, like, how do you encourage and cultivate a healthy traditional folk space, which also doesn't suppress people from going beyond it? It's hard to get that balance right.
Yeah, I guess you need a healthy folk space to begin with, right?
Yeah.
As opposed to built on a tradition that has that traumatized sort of thing going with it. I don't know.
I came up with my dad to visit his brother who lived in Gravenhurst. Had adopted 16 kids, and real interesting guy. Had a lot of presence. Of all my dead relatives, he's the one I felt the most. Right. Still do. And I was out hiking with him, and he pointed out some flower, and he said, "Hey, around here we call that a mountain blackberry." And I thought, that's beautiful, because that is adequately postmodern, right? That's a relativistic conception of what to do in an extremely simple and folksy way. And I thought, I bet there's a good folksiness that has the seeds of the higher complexities in it already, if it could just be sort of stabilized and encouraged.
Yeah, that brings to mind what when we had Carol Sanford on, and she's talking about her upbringing, and part of that is her grandfather is Mohawk, her grandmother, and she was lucky to spend a good amount of time with him. And his indigenous knowing of not fragmenting reality, that everything, coming to it with an open understanding of this living system, and that each being in the system has a role and has its own individual essence, and something that wants to connect that with tradition. And
let's talk about leadership then for a moment. It seems like leadership is potentially, at least at a low level, a polarizing concept, because some people are very attracted to that term, and other people are very suspicious of that term.
Yep.
And dealing with integral leadership as a concept, you must run into these things a lot, where people are like, do we really need to think of this as leadership? Is that a just like an American way to phrase this? Could we call it something else? Why do we even need leaders to get the kind of collective intelligence results we want? So, what's the role? What's the importance of leadership, and how do you hold it in a nuanced way?
Well, one of the ways is to go back to I think it's a 2004 or 2014 paper by Russ, and I forget the name exactly. I usually have it here somewhere. Something like Leaders, Leading, and Leadership, Transformative something. I'll look up the title. But the point is the distinction of these terms. So in the colloquial, leadership is like the group of people who have leader roles, right? The way we're looking at leadership is the complex relationships and interactions between leaders who are people, whether formally or informally in a leader role, and leading, which is the behaviors that said people are doing. And you can take that if you're going to, you're completely looking at it integral. It doesn't even have to be a person. So a leader can be an idea that's causing action in the world, right? Which is changing the interactions between people. And so it's causing, movement in a certain direction, right? So a strange attractor in whatever context is in a way a leader. It has a leader role because it's pulling in a certain direction, right?
Sure.
So do we need people who are trained to be the person in the front of the room to get everybody to go in the right direction? I mean, to a certain degree, you can't have a kindergarten with kids like, developing without some sort of guidance, I'm pretty sure. I mean, I don't know, we could try a Lord of the Flies experiment, but realistically, it's probably good to have people with some more wisdom and space. And at the same time, conventional leadership sort of understandings are about, it's more the great man sort of reality, even if it's transformative or transformational leadership. They all essentially are like, I'm the person who's going to come in and help you change your thing, sort of a white savior kind of deal. So do we need that? No, except that we do need to do that for ourselves. Those of us, in the West who think that we need to go out and fix everything, probably need to take a deeper look at ourselves. There's some work there that needs to be done. And there is a reality in terms of social institutions and human relations that there are power dynamics. There are different ways of having power and using it. And there are various roles that people hold that come with more responsibility or less, or more power or less. And having distinction on what are right ways of being and doing in those roles is important. And then the flip side of that, of everybody realizing that we're all leaders. You're absolutely a leader in a leader role in your own life, unless you're, in a very victimized sort of situation. And the more we take ownership of that for ourselves, and we can start to take that in the various spheres that we have influence in, and then that gets bigger and bigger and bigger. Part of what Natasha and I have been doing for the past 7 years as we came together was just this understanding that there's also came out of some of the disillusionment of some of the teachers that we'd had. It was like, we need to do our own personal work here. So the last 7 years has been a very deep dive into our own personal and familial trauma and healing and generational trauma, and really digging into like some of the deep relational patterns in both of our families and in our union, because we knew that, if we had just jumped into some sort of professional, role of what we're doing, like just started a consulting firm right away, like, yeah, sure, we could have attracted money, but we would have been doing that same thing that everybody else was doing in certain degrees, which is going out there to make a difference instead of really sitting with the deeper teachings of do your own work. And we both have done a decent amount of work. It's not like we're not, but at the same time, we knew, especially the sort of archetypical coming together of our two selves, it was important to really do that work. And it's beautiful to see it all coming together. And it was only around solstice that Natasha was like, all right, done with this. This all needs to happen all at once. And I don't know if other people are experiencing this, but the last 3 or 4 months have definitely been an exponential sort of flowering of a good decade's worth of planting seeds. Looking forward to the spring.
That's beautiful to hear. I was going to ask whether, you feel like it's worked. You more a leader in your own life, both of you now?
Yeah, and a huge part of both of our shadow is a whole lot of projection, and positive projection too. I mean, it's sort of consciousness. If it's not in the moment, it is essentially projection. And we just, we wanted everybody to get together and the family to all just be like this, and like, here's such potential. And part of what gets said very often in our rooms in integral leadership is you have to meet people where they're at. And everybody has their own place in it. And so as we kind of step back from projecting onto other people what their place is, we get to start playing with the people who are actually meant to be in that. So like last night we had a lovely 2 or 3 hour call with Jeremy Johnson, who's becoming a dear brother, and it's just so awesome to be able to be stepping into this new phase of, right, here I am, make myself available. I'll talk to Layman in the morning with my coffee. Why not?
Well, that's all nice to hear. I love Jeremy. How much of, when you think of leadership, how much of the thing you're thinking of is centered around this notion of recognizing and reclaiming projections?
Sort of for me, one of the core essences of integral leadership, as it were, is a healthy mind.
Yeah.
And of just personal development in general. It's sort of the point of that is to get to the root of suffering, which is all the noise, right? What was your question again?
How much of leadership is recognizing and reclaiming projections?
Yeah. So I'd say pretty much like at the more exquisite end, like a huge part of it. Because if you were truly meeting someone where they're at, you're in a sort of an active listening state of being with that person. You're not projecting anything onto them or any what they should be doing or anything, or group or whatever the situation is. There's more of a being present to be a vehicle for the unfolding of the best and highest good. And that's really hard to do if you're getting in the way. Now, in a more expert situation, you can certainly get people to a certain place by telling them where to go. But at least for me, in integral leadership, the way we're using it is really about sort of like it's psychoactive leadership. We're not about being a leader whose role is to show people where to go. We're about holding space to show people how they think, to understand that how you think informs how you be, and you can't change how you be if you're not paying attention to how you think. So yeah.
One of the things that I think of when I think of leadership is a kind of attitude that there's a place for everybody. I sort of think of, what is an integral Julius Caesar? Like what is you were talking about this special forces guy.
Yeah.
There's a sense where you're going to mobilize people, and that involves a tremendous amount of inclusion, because you can't just say, well, you guys don't agree, or you're the Gauls, you're not Romans, right? When you encounter Gauls, you're like, how can these Gauls be on the same side as me? There's a sort of, in the negative sense, it's imperialistic, but in the positive sense, it's the assumption that every type of person you encounter is potentially on the same side. If you could play a role in figuring out what their role should be. So it was like, and when you were describing the sort of, the holarchical notion of leadership, where the convergent or wholeness aspect of any plurality is sort of leading that plurality, it also has to sort of define the functions that come together in that. So I'm fascinated by that, and by the assumption that I hope spreads through the integral community and all these other communities, that everybody is on our side. I just have to figure out how.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it absolutely. And to really, rest in the knowledge of that, everybody. And as you were saying, that part of what was coming up too is this understanding for me of transformative learning at its core. For me, is when you bring two people with differing belief systems together, have them work on something together without talking about their belief systems, essentially fall in love with one another, and then have to sort out the reality that they have different belief systems after the fact. And then I look at the planet and, the idea of regeneration of society and of the biosphere and of our own personal selves. And so much of that work that needs to be done is essentially gardening. Whether it's a permaculture garden or gardening of the soul or like gardening of your community, right? And we've been so separated from that the joy of having your hands in the dirt, the smell of the dirt, and however that metaphor plays out. Yeah, I keep distracting myself with this idea.
That's okay.
Like, oh, that's
I like your distracted self too.
Okay. This is my distracted morning, not quite hydrated. Did a little drywall before talking, so. That's a whole nother aspect of this. We're living in the midst of a remodel for the past 3 months. So,
I love that stuff personally. Like, it really helps keep me. The thing that I want is not to just be in social and intellectual and conceptual exchange, right? I need to be able to have really good conversations and sit down and do a piece of advanced writing and then go and fix the deck or dig a drainage trench or something like that. And if I don't have that, I feel really askew. I mean, they're all
absolutely.
equally rich activities.
And that brings me back to my train of thought, which was, like Green New Deal. Okay, if that's politically triggering for you, like what are different local programs that we can do that clean up, people's, like one of the ideas I have is having been a house painter, is doing a sort of a leadership training program where you go into a depressed neighborhood and you pick somebody's house and you train people how to paint it. But instead of just, it's not about the trade. It's about, hey, it's also a metaphor for life. Here's this beat up house. You think you can't do anything about it. It's just the way it is, right? But I don't look at that and see a beat up house. I look at that and see infinite potential and what that space can be. And if we collaborate on this, and there's a couple of tools that you'll need to learn. Let's do that. But you don't have to be an expert. We can get this done together. And, after a week of doing it together, they just fixed up somebody's house in the neighborhood. They've learned some skills. They've worked together in a way they haven't before. That's, in the simplest form, in my opinion, that's all that we need to do. Just in all the various, spheres that sort of work can be done. And it's happening. So that's the other side of this. And that's, again, the mapping project. So there's the people, and then I also want to bring knowledge and everything else together. And need a couple. For any really big time web developers out there, or engineers, with whom this resonates.
I appreciate your ability to tease apart the behavioral aspect and the verbal mental content aspect of things, because I think, especially in online conversations, which are almost all just verbal symbolic exchanges, it's easy to get mixed up between the content of what people are saying and what's really going on for them. We talked about that a bit with people using green terms, but they're not at green. And also, it's like this. There's a sense that people have, if we would be able to get together and have a shared spirit and mobilize to face our collective challenges, if only everybody else would agree with us, or if only we were to invent the new grand narrative that could bring us together. And in reality, if people work together and learn to coordinate and share sufferings and efforts and pleasures, that generates a shared spirit, and you can get a narrative later.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's where all the narratives ultimately come from, is after the fact, right?
Yeah, I think so too. I think the Jews knew about the 10 Commandments before they were written down.
Right, exactly. Want to say hi? No. My daughter just doing that. She's not going to say hi.
There's an interesting thing one of the things that I associate with people coming together developmentally and spiritually in work projects is the Gurdjieffian communities. I don't know how familiar you are with that, but he was a unique spiritual teacher, and they have a lot of focus on, we're going to dig a ditch or build a road or, put a thing together. And that's not only our way of getting group cohesion, but also our way of running up against the material in ourselves that's holding us back, is by actually trying to function with people who are different than us. And there's this other aspect of the Gurdjieffian teaching, which is very focused around intentionality. And so I wanted to sort of segue to that, because when I imagine, I look at myself, I go, well, in what ways would I describe myself as having leadership, even relative to myself? And the first thing I come up with is doing intentional deeds, right? Sometimes I call it whim fulfillment because I think it's an important practice, and it brings our parts together, which is to think of a thing that you don't have to do, but that you would love to do, and then make yourself do it. Stay on that, try to manifest that, right? And I think it's a bit like what they used to call the will, although that's a bit of an outdated term, but there is this capacity for self-organization and self-esteem that comes from making yourself do a thing you thought of, and then you're a leader to yourself.
Yeah.
So not really a question in there, but it's something I
know. Yeah, it's a whole question of intention. I'm not familiar directly with Gurdjieff, but Moravith, Gnosis. I don't know if you're familiar with that.
Yep.
But so yeah. And a lot of different stuff was coming up as you were saying that. Yeah, it's part of the core bit of me leading me, being me in the various systems that I'm part of, is having a deep intention, since I was young, to be, a person who is full of love and compassion and holds space for everyone to see that in themselves. And I'm also a person who's had familiar, I'm sure, with the Adverse Childhood Experiences Index. So, if you have a score of 1 or 2, it's bad. If you have a score of 3 or 4, it's really, really bad. And if you're above 5, you're probably dead or in jail by the time you hit middle age, or both and. And I have a score of 10. So I have a perfect trauma score. There's just about anything that could happen to you in some fashion has happened to me. And so this really deep spiritual, sort of mystical rather, not mythical too, personal experience, and then also hyper intellect and deep trauma, right? So I had huge anger issues growing up, and punching holes in walls, and it was right around puberty that, fighting with my brothers, and there was this understanding that if I allowed this thing to take over me, that I could kill my brother. It wasn't just intellectual. I could feel it within myself that I could let go enough that something bad enough could happen. And it just shifted something. Because I'd never been able to quite lie to myself. So even if I was angry, I didn't have the ability to justify it, at least not to myself. I mean, I could verbally, but there was part of me that knew that I was lying. It's like, no, you're gaslighting, dude. I didn't have that word back then, but and in that moment, something shifted. It's like, wow, I can't allow that. I have to take ownership of that. And I'm not sure what my point with that was.
We were talking about leading ourselves.
Yeah. So that was right. So that was a very poignant peak experience for me, really, of understanding how the reactive self can overtake one's will, as it were, and really getting clear on what my will was, and to hold that with integrity, the iron shavings of one's fire, to become the molten fire itself instead of the scattered egoic noise, right? And so there's been a core of that fire since early, and as especially around the time of meeting Natasha and going from my master's degree to my PhD, and the first time I met her, she thought I was a jerk, and I thought she was aloof, and that was my first semester, and I was married at the time, so I mean, it's fitting. But what happened during that first semester is I came to my own personal realization that I couldn't, staying in the relationship I was and the way I was like this sort of martyr mentality, and if it worked, I would have stayed, but it wasn't going to work. Right? And then Natasha had been mourning her partner who had passed 3 years previously, and had just in January, or the beginning of January, just had the realization I'm done with mourning, took off the ring, said goodbye. And then a week or so later, we met for our second semester in our PhD program and started talking. She like touched me in the small of my back. There was this giant energetic, like the cosmos shifted. It was pretty nuts. And then since then, there's just the rise and fall of our life. Like her dad died 2 months before our wedding, and we lived with her mom for most of the last 7 years in a condo, because if we didn't, her mom would have died. And we knew that she was going to be healthy because if she chose to, and she ultimately did. And so we needed to hold space for that. And then the holding space for the healing of my relationship with my girl's mom, to the point where now they're with us, which is only since COVID. In all of that, holding the integrity of the best and highest good and the healthy, happy whole is kind of how we say it. And to, especially in reactive moments, to really grasp for that and to hold that, hold on to that lightning rod of integrity and wholeness and what really wants to come out of this situation is sort of how I've done it. And it's been like I've said in some other contests, this has been the most difficult 7 years, and this last year definitely the most difficult of my life in so many ways. And like, you can't really see it, but I've lost, because you can't see how much hair I had 6 months ago, but I lost like a good, like, this is where my hair was before.
Okay.
The bags under my eyes, and at the same time, it's been so exquisite and so magical, and the going from the kid in upstate New York, in the woods, to having the opportunity to be in the mix of all these different things that I'm in now, and to actually be in a place with more leverage in the world, is lovely, and also a testament to holding that vision with integrity.
That makes me think of, oddly, two people, Norm Macdonald and Mark Foreman. Have you read Mark Foreman's book, The Monster's Journey?
It was impactful. I'm actually working with Mark now, so
yeah. I interviewed him for the author series about the book, but I'm going to talk to him later today. We're trying to set up a generalized integral psychology interview series.
Nice.
So yeah, that's actually probably where I first really paid attention to the adverse experiences index.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I didn't have too many of those experiences myself, but whether, the examples I had and my particular chemistry and whatever my ancestors were, I've had some explosive moments.
Yeah.
And that's where it comes into the Norm Macdonald thing, and he's from Ontario. I'll tie that back in. He has this really disturbing joke, which is about, why would you beat your wife? I mean, she's your wife. It's like keying your own car. Right? There's a weird thing about that joke, which is you're being self-destructive in that moment, right? And I've been in moments where I'm like, what did I just do? Like, upset someone I liked, hurt myself, and wreck some of my stuff. It's like my entire agenda was to thwart myself in this moment. And then you go, well, I might even need to reach for old metaphors. Maybe a demon is the right way to think about this, because that requires decision and vigilance, not just acceptance and inspection. So there's these, and I think that ties into certain leadership qualities, ideally.
Yeah. And understanding that, because it's so easy to be in a space of, blaming, and again, it's projection, right? It's the world is at fault for my stuff. It's my life conditions. It's, it's like, and we're in this infinitely mutable, sort of exponentially nonlinear changing reality that even in the concrete part of it, like the Western capitalistic global society, there are new products every 3 months, right? Like the entire system is retooling itself every freaking day. And yet the belief system is, this can't change. Like, I get it in some degrees, and I get trauma. And then there's part of me is like, because I don't get it, because from a very early age, it was like, yeah, I'm not accepting what is as is. So that's a no-go for me, non-starter. And I guess that's part of the benefit of having some deep traumatic experiences early on, because you can either go full victim and be like, well, I guess this is the way life is. Or you can be like, fuck that.
Yeah, the ability to say no is hugely important in all this if we're going to affect any positive change.
Yeah.
And I think also to, in terms of the things we were just discussing, the ability to get better at integrating aggression seems hugely important, because a part of those, the phenomenon we were talking about of the postmodern language users who aren't really postmodern,
Yeah.
a lot of that seems to me that they haven't been able to integrate aggression properly, and they want to be aggressive at the aggressive people and feel like they don't have any aggression, and it comes out in very perverse ways.
Yeah, absolutely. That's one of one of the practices as a martial artist. How do you and be in a relationship with someone where you're pushing each other to basically to the edge of harming or maiming, one of the most aggressive acts a human being can engage in, and yet you're doing it out of mutual love and respect for the betterment of both of you, right? And for me, there's a loop that I'm feeling that I'm trying to a muscle I'm trying to grow, where that aggression loops around to become fierce love. Fierce love for and compassion, so that also it doesn't become, there isn't this, that love doesn't become watered down as something that means compromise, right? In terms of what we're saying, holding that true north of best and highest good also means clear boundaries. Loving boundaries with your children does not feel like love to your children subjectively some of the time. They'll grow up later and they'll thank you for it, I'm sure. But at the time, no. And yeah. So I'm working with how to harness the aggression and how to do it with compassion, because I can certainly go to the just deep hyper aggressive. Well, not as much lately, but it's still in there.
Leadership's interesting around children, because the kind of people we like to talk to lean toward a rich embrace and flexible tolerance of things. But when it comes to kids, they do need a lot more of that than they used to get in the old civilizations, but they also need a lot of command structure. And it's often uncomfortable. I mean, we struggle with it a little bit too. Like how easy do you feel just giving orders rather than getting into discussions about why, or taking your role as simply to accommodate whatever is being produced out of their mouths, or things like that. So how have you seen the leadership role apply in yourself relative to children and at different ages? Simple question.
my girls are 12 and going on 14. So had I known 10 years ago what I know now, might be a different answer.
Well, that's them. To me, that's the most fascinating part. What would you have done differently 10 years ago if you were the person you are now?
I would have been more direct and just had more rule-based when they were younger, and less pluralistic, as it were, for sure. Just very clear boundaries. This is how things are done. And of course, I was still working with a lot of the anger issues with their mom. So there was a little bit more yelling in the household and that sort of thing. And to be honest, I wasn't always the most loving and kind dad when I was giving boundaries, although we've all, evolved. But it is certainly a sort of core theme in our household of privilege And the accompanying responsibility of that, I think.
You would have been more loving and more authoritarian if you had it to do over again.
More lovingly authoritarian. And then now because a lot of what we're doing now is unpacking behaviors from earlier. It's like, and also because the girls grew up a lot not in mine and Natasha's household, and then would come to us for, cottage in the summer, and unpacking a lot of just conventional behaviors. It's like, yeah, so on that TV show, somebody says something like that, it gets a laugh, right? Because conventional humor in conventional society is largely mean, right? So now imagine if I say this like this to you. Oh, right. Okay. So, and then, so it's like giving them awareness of their own behaviors and how they're affecting people. And then the larger context of, hey, a lot of the kids, in school don't have the same opportunities that you have, right? So should you want to step in more into the role and into, the responsibility of it, the more you do the work for yourself, the more opportunity you have to offer your friends. Like, we're in Canada now, like you want to go, there's like a really awesome camp that the girls are going to go to. And it's like, go do that work, become a part of that system. And the next year, if it's in alignment, one of your friends can come for the summer. We'll get them a scholarship, and they'll get an opportunity that they would have never had before. And then that's also sort of just a fractal mapping of how you can be in the world to whatever. And we try to frame it to whatever you're called to do. You don't have to necessarily take the reins of the family business, but do need to be aware that you have effect on people and take responsibility for that. And then decide where in the general collective, as time goes on, where you fit.
What's your sense of Jordan Peterson?
I wish I had read more of him. I really appreciated the first hour of him on Joe Rogan. I didn't get through the first 2 hours or the full thing, but I think like the first hour. That was 3 years ago now, right? It was interesting. Before he kind of crashed and burned, I was going to look him up because he's at the University of Toronto. I don't know. There's, and I'm not super familiar with this stuff, but I think sort of in the same league of Sam Harris in a way, though different. And Sam is definitely cleaner and more, I think, more discernment overall. But I see him as someone who had a certain understanding of belief systems and how they affect the world, but not necessarily a larger, truly metasystemic understanding of the various interlocking, interdependent systems of biopsychosocial, spiritual, unfolding, and got caught up in the whole shock jock. Oh, I can say something that's sort of controversial and look at all the attention and flow that gets, because if he's in his long form, I found he had a lot of distinction, but if in short form, just a lot of lack of distinction, a lot of pretty polemical sort of positions. So yeah, I don't know, like in terms of like what's the point of that. And I'm gonna have to, if he's still around another year or so, have to dig a little deeper. Someone who has some good, important distinctions, like a following, is probably waking people up to a certain degree across the spectrum. And at the same time, there's definitely some clear, shadow there.
Yeah, I like him as a person. I think a lot of people who are agitated by him don't realize how sensitive he seems to be. A really sensitive guy.
Absolutely.
And have a patriotic investmentism as a Canadian and a University of Toronto character. And I think he holds space for almost a conservative postmodernism, which is really interesting. And he definitely suggests a higher perspective at times. And I think he's evolving, but he came up for me because I think a lot of the things that people were looking to him for was something around leadership and authority and leading yourself, right? Don't worry so much about society, clean up your room first. Now, I didn't love his little short form books. I much more appreciated the earlier maps of meaning and sort of psychodynamic stuff. But I think what he means to a lot of people is the potential of taking more clear control and boundaries about their own lives.
Yeah, and then what's curious for me is our folks like him who had an important offering and then crashed and burned a bit, and and sort of from the outside looking in, there were some, and we're all teaching what we need to learn, right? And sort of that sort of personal reality, but he didn't quite get the personal thing dialed in as well as it needed to be to hold that level of fame, as it were. And my hope, and also what I've tried to be is to hold space for the further transformation. Because I agree with you, like his first hour with Joe Rogan, he's like super personal. I was like, I really like this guy. Like he cares, right? He's not just sensitive, he's sincere, he's loving. He's like, he means it, right? And so do my family who voted for Trump. And so then it's like, all right, so then there's value there. And instead of being like, resonate with the value and also start to have clean and loving boundaries and distinction. I think part of the whole conservative thing, and it's not just conservative, earlier stages of development have much more, they just don't have the tools necessarily to be separating opinion from fact, for example, and the degree of that spectrum, we'll say. I don't need to get into a philosophical discussion of whether or not there is such a thing, but as fact. But there's certainly a spectrum of discernment about shared reality that we can agree upon, and that's one of the things that Western science is good at is discernment on the fragmented side, right? I'm clearly in the not holding long thought pieces here at the moment.
Well, I bet we're coming to the end of this thing. It's been an hour and a half, and that's about how much I feel people could reasonably listen to or watch if they were interested in.
Right.
Anything else on your mind? Anything we haven't covered that's been percolating?
It's funny you mentioned Marshall McLuhan. Andrew hangs out in our room in Clubhouse now and again.
Good, yeah.
Apparently he would approve. Nice guy too. Anything I would like to add?
That whole thing. I mean, one of the beautiful things about the 4 quadrants is that it holds open a space for systems and structures to have like a formal influence, which is, I think, like that McLuhan thing, like the way your brain's structured and the way you think and the types of media you operate, the systems in which you're bedded by virtue of their very architecture cause things to happen regardless of what you thought or felt or your opinions and things like that. I think that's a huge, I'm glad that the integral map has an equally important place for that.
Yeah. I mean, there's a fundamental difference in terms of like civic systems, like growing up in a brick building, going out onto a asphalt street and grinding on a bus or a subway to go to something is very different than walking out of your hut and barefoot in the dirt with like all the life around you. And so that's going to have very different brain structures and way of relating, and that on all the different levels. What also came up as you were saying that, because we can argue to what degree reality is socially constructed, but one of the things that's becoming pretty clear in the research, and Rianne Eisler's newest book, Nurturing Humanity, has a lot of really good stuff in it. But one of them that's pretty clear is that sexual dimorphism in mammals is socially constructed. So, and people are going to argue with that left and right, but the vast majority of the hormonal response that we have that creates the physical differences between man and woman are socially constructed. And there are primates where it's flipped just because, and within a generation, because the society flipped. I'll just leave it at that. But that one always comes back to like this whole male, female, and men are bigger and women are smaller and men are stronger and women aren't. It's just something we made up. And, at the same time, what you were saying about systems, right? Different social realities within other animal systems, they also made it up, and the system made it for them, right? So in a lot of situations, the way that it evolved was potentially for the male to be the more martial thing. But then again, maybe not. Like lions wouldn't eat if the women didn't hunt.
One of the things I love about the way you're thinking about leadership is it's so diverse. I mean, like a landscape can be a leader, right? A procedure can be a leader. The causative effects can be downstream of almost any kind of structure.
Look how memes flash across social media and then affect how people behave. I mean, that meme is a leader, right? It's causing people to do something that they wouldn't otherwise do. Yeah, I mean, that's and then that's the other side of it. If you're really sitting with a deep appreciation for all of reality as an interconnected whole, right?
Well, this has been great. I've had a nice time getting to know you better, and I like that you're just down the road from me, even though just down the road in Ontario is the span of several European countries.
That's true. Yeah, once COVID dies down and weather shifts, I wouldn't mind going up your way, and certainly
that would be real nice to see
at the cottage.
Okay, well, I look forward to some more interaction with you, Eric. Thanks very much.
Definitely. You too. Have a great one.